I'm ready for the next 4 years because I've got my crystal ball and I can see what's going to happen. First, over the next few months, pundits will scream about the fiscal cliff. That's a series of tax increases and budget cuts that'll automatically go into effect January 1st unless Congress works out a deal. Will they? Yes, I can see it in here. Politicians will meet and then they'll hold press conferences and fret and predict disaster, and then they'll reach a deal right before the end. It won't solve much, it'll just postpone the reckoning, but they'll congratulate themselves and the media will move on to something else. America, however, will continue to go broke. Am I too cynical? No, it's probably worse than that, says my next guest, Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman, predict the future.
Long term, the future looks pretty good. A lot of people are waking up and know that what we have today isn't workable. But on the short run, the people in charge aren't going to admit it. They're not going to admit that we're bankrupt, and that they won't admit that we're on the verge of a major change in our society. So they'll keep putting it aside, and but then we'll eventually probably destroy the dollar or have a dollar crisis where we'll be forced to revamp and change our system of financing. But it could be pretty big. I mean, I think it could won't be anything quite as bad as like when the Soviet system collapsed, but a lot of change would have to come, because I think the true bankruptcy would mean that we no longer can maintain an empire around the world, and we no longer can maintain promises of entitlements of $222 trillion, so we have to face up to reality. But I think I agree with you. Don't expect all the solutions to come on January 1st. They're going to have some doctored up proposal and people will announce it and the stock market may go up, but ultimately we will have to face up to, the excessive spending and the excessive size of government, but not for a little while yet.
Though that sequestration law on January 1st was designed to acknowledge the politicians' unwillingness to make tough cuts. Here's how Jim Engel of Fox reported it.
The fiscal cliff was crafted to be so distasteful, officials would do any and everything to avoid it.
So you don't think they'll say, gee, we don't want to cut this money from the military, domestic spending, we're finally going to cut entitlements, make some real decisions?
They assume that they made it so bad that they wouldn't accept it, but I don't think they did anything. They're not even talking about cuts. They're talking about cutting, $1 trillion over 10 years, $100 billion, and they're not talking about real cuts. They're talking about cuts in baseline budgeting.
Let me stop you. Explain baseline budgeting. And I hate it when you politicians talk that way, because no person who's normal understands that. What you mean is that if I'm going to cut, it means I spend less next year. When you guys do it, it means?
It means that we have already written into the next 10-year budget automatic increases. So if you're proposing, let's say, $10 billion increase for next year and you cut it down to 9, they say they're cutting 10%. But they're not cutting anything. They're only increasing it $9 billion instead of $10 billion. So it's done on purpose so that people get confused, and that cuts don't mean anything. Cuts mean only nibbling away at the proposed increases, and that's the reason nothing ever happens. And they've got away with this for a long time because both sides, whether liberals or conservatives, they had different reasons they wanted to spend money, and there was a lot of wealth in the country, and they usually could get along with it. Okay, we'll raise milk subsidies and tobacco subsidies, and we'll vote for you one versus the other. But now the Treasury's bare, the country's bankrupt, they won't admit it, and that's why there's so much anger and frustration, because it's hard to divvy up loot when there's none left to divvy up.
Thank you, Congressman Paul. The focus in the media this week is that if the automatic tax increases, and 4/5 of this cliff is tax increases, if they and the spending cuts do happen, the cuts total $55 billion from defense, $55 billion from domestic spending into the future, that will be terrible.
It's a nightmare. I'm worried about it too.
Because that's a total disaster.
Which really will create chaos.
And drive our economy off the fiscal cliff.
Really? Well, one of the people who teaches me economics says, no, sequestration might be okay. That's Russ Roberts of the Hoover Institute. So it's not this big, horrible crisis?
Well, when government spending is about $3.8 trillion, and you're going to cut $100 billion, that's a deck chair on the Titanic. It's not really a dramatic change. Now,
And it might be good, even if it's across the board.
Well, if they're actual cuts, I think that would be great. And I think across the board is the way to go. I'd cut 10, 20% across the board if I had my druthers. But I think across the board scares people because they think, well, no, let's cut the things that were really let's save the things that are really important and cut the things that are not so important. That never works. Across the board, actually.
Everybody says it's all important.
It's all important. It's all crucial. Now, the tax increases sound scarier. That's about $400 billion. Of course, we have
so much more than the cuts, four times as much.
But we have $1 trillion deficit. We're already spending for the last 4 years, each year, $1 trillion more than we take in. So saying, oh, we're going to raise taxes by $400 billion in 1 year, well, we're already raising them $1 trillion in the future. So to me, the idea of raising taxes is probably a good idea. It says this spending that we've been doing is not a free lunch.
And not just raising taxes by eliminating the Bush tax cuts. They're now talking about let's even things out a bit, get rid of some deductions, make the code simpler. That wouldn't be bad.
Well, tax reform would be a really great idea. There's good tax reform and there's bad tax reform. Some deductions probably would be good to get rid of. Some maybe not so good for the economy as a whole. But certainly the idea of tax simplification, of taking advantage of this scary fiscal cliff, would be a good idea to prod Congress into simplifying the tax code. And that would be good for the economy.
But simplifying means eliminating deductions. And as I look at the list of them, I can't see Congress agreeing to them because it's deductions for pension contributions. That's the biggest. Mortgage deduction, earned income tax credit, the deduction for having children, charity. They're not going to, I don't need this to say, they're not going to give that up.
They're not going to touch those. What they could do is put a cap on the size, the total amount of deductions. Someone could take an idea that Romney suggested in the campaign, I think will be appealing to certainly to the Democrats and maybe to the Republicans.
Now, 20% of the budget and about half the fiscal cliff spending cuts would come from the military budget. Russ, you're not a defense specialist, so let's bring in Ben Friedman of the Cato Institute. So it's almost a 10% cut, I'm told. It's terrible. The Republicans are hysterical about this.
The Pentagon's hysterical about it. Both parties are hysterical, but it's about 10%, which would bring us roughly back to where we were in defense spending in 2006. Which
adjusted for inflation?
Adjusted for inflation, which was not exactly a crisis year in the Pentagon. So it's really a minor cut, and they've gotten very spoiled at the Pentagon. They had years of luxury and big increases. And so as soon as you cut the budget a bit, they scream to the heavens.
Defense Secretary Leon Panetta says it would weaken our defense system, be irresponsible. Senators McCain and Graham, these draconian cuts represent a threat to our national security and must not occur.
I don't think it's the best way to cut the defense budget, sequestration, but I think it could be useful. I think we need actually probably bigger cuts in the defense budget because we do too much. So this will force us, I think, to make some choices. I think austerity...
What do you mean we do too much?
We try to be everything in the world. We try to deliver peace and prosperity to every corner of the world, pretending that every unstable country is a threat to us. We have too many rich allies that we're defending that long ago developed the ability to defend themselves. So if we cut a bit, we might have to reconsider some of that and prioritize more.
Now, when President Obama in the debate talked about being able to save on things because the military was being forced to pay for things they don't even want, I was skeptical. But looking it up, these Abrams tanks, the Pentagon says it's a hulking, clanking vehicle. The Army says they've exceeded their space, weight, and power limits. The Army Chief of Staff, warfare has changed. We can't believe we'll ever see a straight conventional conflict again. And yet Congress insists on buying more of these things?
Well, the Abrams tank is not the only procurement program that's like that. What happens is it's built somewhere that's politically important, so the people from that state never want to turn it off. So that's built in Ohio and somewhat in Michigan, which has a lot of important members in Congress, so they keep saying buy more and more.
Russ, let's return to the big picture. They're talking about cuts, if they happen. After the cuts, spending will still grow over the next 10 years by $1.65 trillion as opposed to $1.8 trillion. Big deal.
I think we're sending a signal to the world that we're not acting like grown-ups, we're not mature, we're not responsible, and I think it'd be great if somebody in Washington could take the lead and say, hey, it's time to act like a grown-up. When you spend $3.8 trillion, it's not so much whether we're covering it with taxes today or borrowing. The most important thing, as I learned from Milton Friedman, is what are you spending the money on? And I don't think we get $3.8 trillion worth of value from what we're currently spending on. It'd be better
Not from food stamps. They're going up sharply.
Well, the people who receive food stamps like them. That's not the worst thing the government does.
How about people are disabled? Payments up sharply for that.
Growing dramatically.
So the country gets safer all the time, but more people collect disability payments.
That law has been liberalized, and the courts have interpreted in ways that make it easier for people to go on disability.
And this one scares me, the value of government-guaranteed mortgages going through the roof.
Yeah, they're being a little more cautious now. I'd be more worried about the value of pensions to state employees, which are going to be very difficult for the federal government not to step in and honor the promises that state governments have made. That's another probably $4-point-something trillion. $4-point-something trillion on top of everything else. We've made too many promises we can't keep. We've got to somehow find a way to live a little bit closer to our means and to spend our money a little more wisely.